challenges we face are deeply woven into our history.
I think this President Biden acknowledges his own role in systemic racism.
The president's core objectives is addressing racial injustice.
We want to talk about systemic racism, and that's the history of the Democrats.
This is nothing more than an unconstitutional power grab by Democrats.
Woke culture has officially entered the classroom, but one teacher says here's a way for students to escape indoctrination.
Unless we address the progressivism in the university, we're going to completely miss out on actually fixing the problem in the classroom.
Celebrate our independence on July 4th. We still have more to do in the months of May and June.
Was ahead of today's funeral, Matt.
Brian, here in Minneapolis yesterday, there were celebrations in the street for Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict. Now today at this church behind me, 20-year-old Daunte Wright's funeral. Wright was shot by a Potter. He's a 26-year police veteran who claims she accidentally shot Wright with her taser instead of her handgun. Potter is charged with second-degree manslaughter. Family and friends attended Daunte Wright's viewing yesterday. The same day, the Department of Justice announced it will launch a patterns and practice probe into the Minneapolis Police Department. At today's funeral, Reverend Al Sharpton will give the eulogy. Attorney Ben Crump is representing the Wright family, who says people all over America saw their own child in Daunte Wright.
When you watch that video, your conscience tells you it is the right thing to do to stand up for Daunte Wright, to speak up for Daunte Wright, and to fight for Daunte Wright.
The funeral is scheduled to start at 12 noon local, and we'll keep you updated throughout the day. Back to you guys.
All right, Matt, thanks so much. So emotions got to be high, and they're quickly going to blame policing again. And we saw yesterday that the Attorney General of the United States is going to do a comprehensive look at police policies and practices on all of Minneapolis after this incident. But if you look back at this woman's history, she's got a great past. She's got a great record. And right now, her husband, who's also a police officer, now retired, and she is going to be have legal issues. But it was brought up earlier by, I think, on this show. I can't remember if it was here or radio. She's really not going to be looking at a trial because
there shouldn't be any ambiguity. You have to be able to grab the weapon that you're announcing that you're going to use. There's been talk of using those other types of guns, the burner guns. They're not even guns. It's just a weapon to fend off an assailant or someone that could break into your house or someone who is committing a crime, but it doesn't kill them. So they're talking about all different types of police reform. I know Tim Scott is working with Democrats. He is trying to negotiate, and they're just trying to come together on the same playing field so everyone can agree.
That's right. So there's one thing to have an earnest conversation about ensuring that policing doesn't end the least amount of times it ends tragically. But when you're starting from the premise that the Minneapolis Police Department is systemically racist, or all of these big town, little town police departments are systemically racist, now you're imputing the motives of the people wearing the badge. They are the bad people, not policies that maybe sometimes are a little too strict or a little too loose. That's what makes this, Brian, so difficult. You're telling people they're racists and then saying, here's a bunch of burdens on top of you as well.
Absolutely. But defund the police, they know, is a loser for everybody because most American people thinks that's ridiculous. Congressman Byron Donalds is not confident that the reform Democrats are talking about are going to reform anything. Came up with something June 17th. It was called the Justice Act. It has things like create a commission to study and offer solutions for a broader range of topics, challenges facing black men and boys and the black community, strengthening training methods and tactics up and down, especially for smaller agencies and departments. Also ensure when a candidate is interviewed, the department looking to hire will have access to their prior disciplinary records, because one of the complaints that people have is if you have problems in New York, you go down to North Carolina and you could start fresh. And they said if you were a problem in New York, you should not be able to get hired in a different department.
What Tim Scott is working on is much different than what Democrats and Joe Biden are pushing right now. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is a radical departure that would put crosshairs on a lot of law enforcement who are trying to do their job and make it even more difficult for them. So what Tim Scott's working on is very important. we'll see ultimately if they can come to a compromise.
President Biden says he's trying to tackle this racial injustice, but Jen Psaki yesterday was questioned about this. Why is the president saying this now? Yet he was responsible, and now he's coming under fire for being responsible for the crime bills back in the 80s and 90s when he was a senator. Listen to this. This is a New York Post reporter, Steve Nelson, challenging Jen Psaki.
He's an architect of multiple federal laws in the 1980s and 90s.
Core objectives is addressing racial injustice in this country, not just through his rhetoric, but through his actions.
I believe it's important to accept his own culpability.
I think I've answered your question.
No, you didn't.
No, you didn't.
That's the Cuomo method. If you can have a staffer hang up on him, have your press spokesperson avoid the follow-up question. And bottom line is, it's a great question. How could President Biden in 2021 stand in front of the American people and say that America has endemic racist, is an endemic racist society, when he's been there since 1975 and has not managed to bring that up? In fact, he had a totally different take in 1993 when we actually were using VCRs. Remember when he said this?
The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill, has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill, and has had a majority vote of the Democratic members of the United States Senate on the bill.
If that is the case, then he is the very systemic racism that he purports to be taking out now. You cannot have it both ways. The logical end state of what Joe Biden will be forced to do is to effectively say, I'm only a president because of white privilege, and I have been a racist my entire career, and everything I will do now is as an anti-racist, and whatever the far left and the Marxists that run the BLM organization want, I'm going to do. Because if so far he's given in to the left wing on all of those things, I don't know how he stops at this point.
Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, he's not buying it. You know who he is, the former congressman. He's now the GOP chair in the state of Texas. He talks about how those Democrats back in the 80s, 90s, those policies that Joe Biden helped implement are destroying and decimating the black family. Listen to this.
Ramblings about systemic racism. We talked about this before. This is just a new Marxism. It is not about class warfare. It's about racial warfare. And the neighborhood that I grew up in was the same neighborhood that produced Dr. King. We got to get back to content of character and not this repeated, diatribe about skin color.
Amen.
Talking about a guy that was brought up in a segregated, was born in, he said, a blacks-only hospital, segregated South. His dad said, your challenge is going to be the first African-American, he goes, the first one in our family to be an officer in the military. And he said, go do it. And he sees where this country's come. He sees where his family was, and he sees the progress this country has made. That used to be the path we were on. Up until around 2014, we had a totally different view of racial relations in America. Right. Now I feel like there's invisible forces trying to tear us apart on an hour, not even a daily basis, on an hourly basis. But as we transition now to Joe Biden's agenda, I should say, correct myself, it is really the Bernie Sanders agenda. The more you look at the person we elected, he totally duped us and said, I'm going to be a moderate. You know me, I'm Joe Biden. You saw all the video from the 1970s. I'm a moderate guy. I'm not a socialist. Well, it turns out he is taking his cues from AOC and Bernie Sanders, and that's not who we elected.
And Kamala Harris, her voting record was even more extreme than Bernie Sanders was.
And this is what he talked about that he wasn't interested in doing.
First it was packing the court, and
he's got a commission for that.
That's right. And now they're talking about making D.C. a state. All of these things that
I think you're right. I'm sure you're right.
According to this is from the New York Post. I read it yesterday in the New York Post, and this is the article.
Here's the overall strategy too, and I'm sure you're right. That they're introducing this legislation in the House. It was just talked before. Now that this I believe that the House is set to vote on a D.C. statehood bill today. So Nancy Pelosi's House is going to vote on whether they would like to acknowledge they'd like to welcome D.C. as a state.
Well, just think about it. You would think it would be hard and difficult to make an area a state.
Sure.
In the United States.
And if they're going to put up all this legislation, and if they're looking at 2022 and all this legislation stopped only because they won't get rid of the filibuster, the pressure on Sinema and Manchin will be so great, they'll open up the floodgates. And all this stuff will pass before they ultimately lose control of the House. Here is a memo from Steve Scalise on why D.C. should not be a state. The D.C. government has failed to provide for the safety and well-being of its citizens. There are currently 57 reported murders this year. That's 30% increase compared to all homicides committed in 2020. Why should the District of Columbia be granted statehood when it can't even perform basic governmental duties like protect protecting its residents against criminals. And this to get Washington, D.C. residents representation. No. This is a hunger for more congressmen and women and more senators to forever change the balance of power in Washington. What institution are Democrats not going to try to turn on its head? None. They're going for all of it.
That's right.
So according to this article, in order to do this, you would first, Brian, have to get a constitutional amendment. And they're saying that's what you would need 2/3 to pass. Nearly impossible given the makeup. Then H.R. 51 would face an uphill battle in the Senate. Democrats would need 10 Republicans to cross over and support the legislation in order to have the 60-vote margin needed to pass it.
So the argument Steve Scalise makes is a good one. I mean, D.C. government is one of the most corrupt governments in the country. It's cronyism writ large. And a lot of that is because of its proximity to the federal government. And James Madison, who wrote in Federalist 43, by the way, which can we still quote that? I don't know if we're allowed to anymore. But he points out there was a very specific reason why they did not make the seat of the federal government a state. They said you don't want the federal government beholden to a particular state was part of the argument. And they also argued the proximity of the district's citizens was enough itself to ensure that their concerns are well represented. Absolutely. Have you met, I mean, the amount of influence among people who live in the District of Columbia is massive. And ultimately, compare that to folks that live in, say, I don't know, Eastern Washington or somewhere out in Oregon. They don't have the level of access that folks in D.C. do. They thought through why this wouldn't be the case precisely because of a moment like this.
Right, and we don't want to go back in history, American history, because a lot of people want to just forget about our history. Yep. They would name it the Washington-Douglas Commonwealth, and they would leave a smaller footprint of Washington, D.C. just be around the federal portions, that we now have fenced in, like Congress and White House.
That's right. Maybe they'll build a wall around it, too. Permanent one.
Yeah.
All right, Jillian has some more headlines for us. Some funny moments, but also some sad moments, too. It's really all over the place.
It was a weird mix. America needed Ted Lasso.
He's such a good guy.
Right.
I love him.
Too bad he doesn't exist.
I don't even know what show you're talking about.
I like his character.
Right.
You got to watch it. It's a soccer show, so of course Brian loves it.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
With the football coach.
It's a coach that's like great, and he transforms the team.
Just for the record, these are normally the conversations we have in the break.
They are.
Yes.
Still ahead, the Biden administration could force...
The Biden administration has filed an appeal against a January court order to keep in place a mandate that would force religious doctors and hospitals to perform gender transition procedures. Critics say the mandate would have devastating implications, not only for the religious freedoms, but medical ethics as well. And here to discuss this is radiologist and policy advisor for the Catholic Association, Dr. Grazie Pazzo Christie, and president of the Becket Fund, which filed many legal challenges on behalf of religious organizations, Mr. Mark Rienzi. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. So, Dr. Rienzi, what has happened in the courts so far? Can you break this down in layman's terms for us?
Sure. This is a mandate that goes back to 2016 from the Obama administration, and it's been challenged in court twice. And both times it's lost because the federal government doesn't have the ability or shouldn't have the ability to force religious doctors and hospitals to provide this type of controversial service that goes against their medical judgment and their religious beliefs. And they've lost in both places. But what happened this week, the important thing that happened this week, is that the Biden administration decided to appeal one of those rulings to try to get it changed, to try to get the ability to force these religious doctors and nurses and hospitals to provide these types of treatments against their medical judgment and against their religious beliefs.
So, Dr. Christie, how do you feel about it? Would you want to perform a gender reassignment surgery?
No, I would never want to do anything that could potentially significantly harm my patient, and at the same time, something that there's no real medical consensus that it actually helps patients in the long term to cure what is their underlying problem, which is gender dysphoria. So our Hippocratic oath is first do no harm. And this is a very problematic thing for doctors, for hospitals, especially in the case of children, where we know most children grow out of gender dysphoria naturally with appropriate support.
That's interesting. And Mark, what's also interesting about this is why would they want to force a doctor to do this surgery if they don't believe in it, or if they're not trained in it? Wouldn't that harm the patient?
Yeah, that's really one of the great ironies of this case, is that if you wanted this service, surely the last people you'd want it from are folks who think it's a bad idea and it's harmful. And I'll just point out the other great irony is that the federal government's own programs often don't cover these types of gender transition procedures precisely because they're lawyers, and this includes the Obama administration lawyers. The Obama administration doctors said that there's insufficient evidence that these procedures are actually helpful for anybody. So these are procedures that the government itself often doesn't cover in their own programs precisely because there's not enough evidence that it helps people, yet they're trying to force these doctors and hospitals and nurses to provide them against their will.
Well, and are there any exemptions if you have religious reasons you don't want to perform this surgery, constitutional reasons?
Well, there certainly are and should be constitutional and statutory protection for these doctors and nurses. But the outrageous thing is that the federal government is now asking courts to take that away. That's the big problem with what the Biden administration just did, is they're trying to take those away.
Dr. Christie and Mark, we really appreciate y'all being here. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. All right, still ahead, the Biden administration now pushing
are receiving backlash from parents and teachers over their woke anti-racist curriculum. One fed-up dad who yanked his daughter out of an elite Manhattan prep school says the indoctrination of our kids is an issue all Americans need to be concerned about. Andrew Gutman telling former New York Times opinion writer Bari Weiss, quote, "This is not a rich person issue. This is not a New York City issue. It is a disaster for education nationwide, which is a disaster for our future." Dr. Carol Swain is a former professor, joins me now. Doctor, thanks so much for being here. You know this stuff better than anybody. When you start to see parents and you start to see teachers calling out these so-called elite institutions, what does it tell you, and does it give us an opportunity to actually push back so many of these bad ideas?
Well, first of all, I can tell you that across the country, people are pushing back. Parents are organizing, and they should be. And I would encourage whistleblowers to step forward with your information, because what is taking place is very dangerous. It is creating a hostile environment for students as well as teachers and administrators. And I know from first-hand experience that if you're in an environment that feels hostile, you cannot be your best self. And what they're doing with the critical race theory is pure indoctrination. It's not teaching young people how to think. In fact, it's teaching the opposite, because if they have questions and their questions are not politically correct, then they risk getting themselves into trouble.
Dr. Swain, I love how you put it. Whistleblowers. This is not merely, you're exposing something. In the era of Zoom, the teachers insist the parents not be there. They want the captive audience. When you see it and you speak up about it, you're right. The institutions will bring the backlash and bring it heavy. Ultimately, how do administrators argue back against parents when they say, you're teaching my kid to hate himself because he's white, or you're emphasizing race? Can they continue to defend this, or once it's exposed, will it fall apart?
Well, I think it should fall apart, and the man that is challenging that at the elite school with his daughter, he's absolutely correct that it is a national problem. And I think that when you point out that the learning environment is hostile, and the environment for teachers, I mean, that's running counter to civil rights laws when it comes to at least hostile workplaces, and teaching young children to hate themselves and their ancestry because of the color of their skin. I mean, that is not something we should be doing in America. We should not be shaming children. We should not be bullying them. We should not be creating intimidating environments. We are doing that under the guise of educational equity. And it's very harmful to minority children because it teaches them that they are victims, that they can't, and it also breaks up relationships that they have. The critical race theorists will come into environments where there are no serious problems, and when they get there, they create problems.
Under the guise of equity is a very different word from equality as well, and they always use equity. Real quick, though, this is why it's so scary, and as was mentioned in the setup, this is not just a New York City or elite thing, because on Monday, the Biden administration announced Dr. Swain, that the Education Department has proposed 2 new priorities for American history and civics education, some of which is the 1619 Project and critical race theory. So are we going to see the federal government start to mandate this to government schools, public schools, private schools across the country?
It's my understanding that they will incentivize it with federal grants. And so schools are always hungry for money. And I believe that if they do that, they will have schools, more schools adopting it. And yes, they do want it national. They want it everywhere. And it's more important than ever for people who can to go to the Federal Register and comment on the rule. I think they have 60 days to comment on the rule. So that needs to be done. But in the meantime, across America, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative, you have a child that's dependent on you. It's very important for you to protect your child. And it is important for people not to work under oppressive conditions. And right now, not a lot of education is taking place in America at our colleges and universities, and now in the K through 12 schools. And we're going to reach a point, Pete, where the only educated children in America are the homeschooled children and the ones in classical education programs and those few private schools where they have not allowed the nonsense in.
It's amazing. It's such a dangerous tipping point moment. And Dr. Swain, you've been writing about it for years. We're going to look more into this Education Department comments. I hope folks will check that out and directly put their input in, because if the dollars are attached to it, schools are going to do it. Dr. Carol Swain, thank you so much.
Thank
you. Really appreciate it. One of the smartest ladies on television. All right, coming up in the wake of Derek Chauvin.
The murder of George Floyd launched a summer of protest we hadn't seen since the civil rights era in the 60s. Protests that unified people of every race and generation in peace and with purpose to say enough, enough, enough of this senseless killings.
And I know it's coming up on a difficult anniversary, that marking when your husband was killed. What is your response from the president looking back favorably on this period in our country?
It's disheartening that our leaders are downplaying this and they're not calling for peace. They should be demanding peace from everyone in our communities and, let the courts work it out like they did. Wait for a verdict. Don't just jump to conclusions and make statements. They're going to
makes his comments during the day in the Oval Office while the verdict still had not been, they never came to a decision.
Exactly. Him, Maxine Waters, and celebrities that are out there making comments publicly that are going to influence people.
How have you dealt with the last year?
Day by day. I take it day by day. It's been a very hard journey without my husband with me.
And knowing the assailant never should have been out. This guy had 2 armed robbery convictions, just ravaging through the city. And he decides to look at your husband when your husband tries to subdue him and stop him from looting. He turns around seemingly without a second thought and takes the life of your husband. Is it hard to wrap your head around that?
Yeah, it is. He pretty much ambushed my husband. My husband realized he was there. And my husband was talking to someone else, trying to dissuade them from looting when this young man walked up and shot him.
And since that time, St. Louis has been anything but calm. You expect to be the murder capital of the world again, of the country again this year, and crime is only going up per capita. A lot of people have left the city, but crime is going up per capita, including the murder rate, the homicide rate.
Exactly. Yes, we're at an all-time high to pass what we did in 1993.
Do you sense an urgency for law and order in your city?
I do. People want peace. The neighbors and the community want peace. They don't want this violence. We have too many children being shot.
Have you seen action coming from your Attorney General? Have you seen action coming from law enforcement?
Our attorney, Eric Schmidt, is trying to work on some things, yes. The law enforcement community itself, our officers are very, very dedicated, and they love the communities they work in. There's one bad apple you can't let that spoil everybody. And our officers are out there to work, and they want to help the community. They want to work and do their job, and they do it with respect every day.
Right, the way your husband did his job every day. Ann Dorn, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. Meanwhile, coming up straight ahead, Will Cain is at the border. He's sitting down with America's sheriffs. They're talking about the border crisis they see every single day and is being ignored. Plus,